Before Hezekiah was born, the world around Judah was already collapsing under fear. The Assyrian Empire had risen like a storm across the ancient Near East, crushing kingdoms, erasing cities, and reshaping power through terror. Assyria was not just an empire, it was a system of psychological domination designed to break resistance. Before battle even began, its armies moved with terrifying efficiency, its kings ruled through brutality, and its reputation alone was often enough to force surrender. Cities that resisted were burned, populations were deported, leaders were humiliated, and the survivors were left as living warnings. Assyrian reliefs carved into palace walls showed enemies being flayed, impaled, chained, and paraded not as exaggeration, but as deliberate propaganda. The message was clear: resistance meant extinction. Smaller kingdoms lived in constant dread, knowing that one wrong decision could invite annihilation. Judah was one such kingdom, small, surrounded, and fragile, located directly in the path of Assyrian expansion. While Assyria ruled through strength, Judah struggled with identity, leadership, and fear. Long before Hezekiah opened his eyes, the land he would inherit was already wounded spiritually, politically, and psychologically. The shadow of Assyria loomed over every decision, every prayer, and every throne. Judah's king at this time was Ahaz, Hezekiah's father, a ruler remembered not for courage but for submission. Ahaz came to power during one of the most dangerous moments in Judah's history, when Assyria was tightening its grip and regional alliances were collapsing. Instead of preparing his people for resistance, Ahaz chose survival through surrender. When neighboring kingdoms threatened him, Ahaz did not seek unity or reform. He turned directly to Assyria for protection, inviting the empire into Judah's affairs. This decision marked a turning point. Judah became a client state stripped of independence, forced to pay heavy tribute and submit to foreign dominance. The cost of this submission was not only economic, but spiritual and cultural. Ahaz emptied the temple of its treasures, melting gold, and sacred objects to satisfy Assyrian demands. This act symbolized Judah's humiliation, a sacred space reduced to a bargaining tool. Foreign altars were introduced, pagan practices spread, and traditional worship was compromised. Judah's identity fractured as fear replaced faith and obedience replaced leadership. For the people, this period was one of confusion, despair, and quiet anger. They watched their king bow while Assyria grew bolder. Assyrian officials walked freely through the region. Assyrian gods were honored, and Assyrian power reshaped daily life. Children grew up hearing stories of destroyed cities, deported families, and kings who vanished into captivity. Fear was no longer an emotion, it was an environment. It shaped how people spoke, how leaders ruled, and how nations survived. It was into this world that Hezekiah would be born, a world where survival meant submission and resistance seemed suicidal. Judah had learned to lower its head rather than raise its sword. The people adapted to humiliation because they believed it was the only way to live. Under Ahaz's leadership, Judah lost more than territory. It lost confidence and moral direction. Prophets warned of consequences, priests were silenced, and tradition was bent to accommodate power. Assyria did not need to destroy Jerusalem because fear had already done the work. The kingdom functioned, but without pride, without vision, and without hope. This atmosphere mattered because leaders are shaped by the worlds they inherit. Before Hezekiah could choose courage, he first had to witness cowardice before he could believe. In resistance, he had to grow up surrounded by surrender. His childhood environment was saturated with stories of Assyrian terror and Judah's weakness. Palace corridors echoed with discussions of tribute, not strategy, survival, not strength. Ahaz ruled cautiously, avoiding confrontation, but every act of avoidance strengthened Assyria's grip. The people learned that kings could kneel, temples could be looted, and identity could be traded for safety. This normalization of fear was perhaps Assyria's greatest victory. Kingdoms that internalized terror no longer needed to be conquered. They governed themselves through submission. Judah lived in this state when Hezekiah's life began. The air itself felt heavy with inevitability, as if resistance was a forgotten concept. Assyrian dominance was not just political, it was psychological, cultural, and spiritual. Every festival, every ritual, every political decision was influenced by the question, will this anger Assyria? This was the world that awaited Hezekiah, a kingdom. Alive but diminished, functioning, but broken, protected, but enslaved. The contrast between what Judah was meant to be and what it had become created tension beneath the surface. Older generations remembered stronger kings and independent days. Younger ones knew only fear and foreign control. This generational divide mattered because it shaped the future king's inner conflict. Hezekiah would grow up hearing two stories, one of what Judah once was, and another of what Judah had become. The clash between memory and reality would define his identity. Assyria's presence was constant, not always visible, but always felt like a storm waiting to strike. Cities to the north fell one by one. Refugees passed through Judah, carrying horror stories that confirmed the empire's reputation. Assyria was not just a threat, it was a lesson repeated endlessly. Do not resist, do not hope, do not challenge. Kings across the region learned this lesson, and most survived by obeying it. Ahaz embodied this philosophy fully. He believed submission was wisdom and fear was realism. But in doing so, he passed something dangerous to his son, not just a weakened kingdom, but a broken model of leadership. Hezekiah's earliest environment was therefore not neutral, it was instructive. It showed him what fear does to leaders, what submission costs a nation, and how power without conviction hollows a kingdom from within. This phase of history is essential to understand, because Hezekiah's later courage cannot be understood without first seeing the depth of fear that preceded it. He did not rise in a world of hope, he emerged from a world that had accepted humiliation as normal. Assyria defined the rules, Judah obeyed them, and the future seemed already written. But history often changes direction, not through strength, but through reaction to weakness. And in this dark, fearful world, the foundation of a very different king was being laid. A king who would one day look at the same empire that terrified his father and choose a different path. But before that choice could be made, the world had to be this dark, this oppressive, and this unforgiving. Phase 1 is not about Hezekiah himself, but about the pressure that shaped him, the fear that surrounded his birth, and the empire that taught Judah how fragile survival could be. It is the stage on which his entire story would later unfold. Hezekiah was born into a palace that carried the weight of fear rather than pride. His birth did not occur in a time of celebration, but in an era where survival itself felt temporary. Judah was still breathing, but barely standing, and the royal house reflected that fragility. From the moment Hezekiah entered the world, he was surrounded by anxiety, whispered conversations, and constant reminders of Assyrian dominance. His father King Ahaz ruled not as a confident leader, but as a man permanently bracing for disaster. Palace guards spoke in hushed tones, messengers arrived with bad news more often than good, and decisions were made not with vision, but with fear. This environment shaped Hezekiah before he could even understand it. As an infant and toddler, he absorbed tension through atmosphere rather than instruction. Children learn safety or danger not through words, but through how adults behave. And Judah's palace radiated uncertainty. Ahaz's fear was not hidden, it was visible in his posture, his choices, and his constant need for Assyrian approval. Hezekiah grew up watching his father defer, bow, and comply. He saw Assyrian officials treated with more respect than Judah's own priests and generals. This reversal of authority quietly taught him that power without courage leads to humiliation. Even before Hezekiah could speak, he lived inside a system that rewarded submission and punished independence. Religious life during his childhood was deeply confused. Foreign idols stood alongside sacred traditions, and worship lost its clarity. For a child, this created identity conflict, because rituals no longer reinforced a stable sense of meaning. Hezekiah was exposed to multiple belief systems not through curiosity, but through compromise. This planted early questions in his mind about truth, loyalty, and consistency. Unlike children raised in confident kingdoms, Hezekiah did not grow up assuming his world was safe or right. Instead, he learned to observe, closely noticing contradictions between what Judah claimed to believe and how it actually lived. This habit of observation became one of his strongest good habits later in life. As he grew into early childhood, Hezekiah displayed signs of seriousness uncommon for his age. Caretakers noted that he was quieter, more attentive, and less impulsive than other royal children. While others played freely, Hezekiah often lingered near adults, listening to discussions about politics, tribute, and survival. This early exposure to adult concerns accelerated his psychological maturity, but also robbed him of carefree innocence. He learned early that mistakes carried consequences not just for individuals, but for entire nations. His relationship with his father was complex and distant. Ahaz was physically present, but emotionally absent, consumed by fear and political pressure. Hezekiah rarely saw confidence modeled at the highest level, which forced him to develop internal standards rather than inherit them. This created both strength and weakness. Strength because he learned to rely on internal conviction, weakness because he lacked emotional reassurance from authority figures. As a result, Hezekiah developed a strong internal dialogue, questioning decisions, motives, and outcomes from an early age. This habit later became his capacity for reflection and planning, but in childhood, it also manifested as anxiety and self-restraint. He learned not to speak carelessly, not to act impulsively, and not to draw unnecessary attention. Survival culture teaches children to minimize risk, and Hezekiah internalized this deeply. Education during his childhood was influenced heavily by priests and prophets who still clung to older traditions and moral teachings. These figures provided him with an alternative model of leadership based on responsibility, faith, and accountability rather than fear. Hezekiah listened intently to these teachings and contrasted them with his father's actions, creating an internal conflict between what leadership should be and what it had become. This conflict did not produce rebellion in him as a child, but contemplation. He did not openly challenge his environment. Instead, he absorbed lessons, quietly storing them for the future. One of his earliest good habits was patience. He learned to wait, observe, and endure rather than react emotionally. However, this patience came with emotional suppression. Hezekiah rarely expressed anger, sadness, or confusion openly, which later made him appear calm and composed, but also isolated. As he grew older into late childhood, he became increasingly aware of Judah's humiliation. He understood that Assyria was feared, not respected, and that Judah's submission was not peace, but dependency. Stories of destroyed cities reached his ears. Refugees passed through Jerusalem, and elders spoke nostalgically of past kings who ruled independently. These stories planted a sense of loss in Hezekiah, not for things he had personally experienced, but for an identity he felt was stolen before his time. This created a strong internal motivation to restore what was lost. Yet because of his upbringing, he also feared the cost of resistance. This duality defined his childhood psychology: courage shaped by fear, idealism restrained by realism. Hezekiah's moral compass formed early, but cautiously. He believed in right action, but was deeply aware of consequences. Unlike reckless children, he did not assume protection was guaranteed. Instead, he believed survival had to be earned. This belief later influenced his emphasis on preparation, planning, and infrastructure. Even as a child, he showed interest in practical matters: how cities functioned, how walls protected, how water flowed, and how order was maintained. These interests were not accidental, they were responses to insecurity. Children who grow up in unstable environments often seek control through understanding systems. And Hezekiah was no different. However, his childhood was not entirely dark. There were moments of learning, mentorship, and quiet hope. Certain priests and elders recognized his seriousness and nurtured it, teaching him history, law, and the stories of leaders who stood firm in difficult times. These narratives offered him a blueprint for alternative leadership, one that did not rely on empire approval. These teachings became anchors in his identity, preventing him from fully internalizing fear as destiny. Yet growing up under Ahaz also planted one of Hezekiah's most persistent weaknesses: the tendency toward moral rigidity. Witnessing compromise and corruption made him later view deviation as dangerous, which limited his tolerance for ambiguity. As a child, he learned that small compromises led to great humiliation, and this lesson hardened into a black and white worldview over time. While this clarity strengthened his resolve, it also reduced flexibility. Emotionally, Hezekiah matured quickly, but paid a price. He carried the emotional weight of a nation. Long before he carried its crown, he felt responsible not by title, but by empathy absorbing the collective anxiety around him. This early burden shaped his later leadership style, which emphasized responsibility over charisma, endurance over celebration, and protection over expansion. His childhood environment did not teach him how to conquer, but how to survive. This distinction is critical because it explains why Hezekiah later chose resistance. Without aggression, preparation without conquest, and faith without fanaticism. By the time he reached adolescence, the foundations of his character were firmly set, disciplined, reflective, cautious, and deeply committed to preventing Judah from repeating the mistakes he had witnessed. Phase 2 reveals that Hezekiah was not born fearless, he was born into fear and learned to live above it. His strength did not come from ignorance of danger, but from intimate familiarity with it. And this childhood shaped not only the king he would become, but the kind of survival story history would remember. As Hezekiah entered adolescence, the quiet observer of childhood began transforming into a thinker shaped by tension, memory, and responsibility. This phase of his life was defined not by action, but by internal construction as his identity slowly separated itself from the shadow of his father. Adolescence for Hezekiah was not a time of rebellion in the open sense, but of deep internal resistance. He was old enough now to understand political reality, religious compromise, and the cost of fear-based leadership. He saw clearly that Judah's weakness was not only military, but moral, and this realization unsettled him. Because it meant survival required more than obedience, it required change. Hezekiah spent much of his youth listening rather than speaking, studying rather than performing, and questioning rather than accepting. He paid close attention to court politics, observing how advisors navigated fear, how priests justified compromise, and how loyalty shifted depending on Assyrian pressure. This sharpened his ability to read people, one of his most important strengths later as king. During this time, he developed a habit of studying history with purpose, not as stories, but as warnings and instructions. He focused especially on earlier kings of Judah and Israel, comparing moments of strength with moments of collapse. He noticed patterns: pride led to downfall, fear led to submission, and discipline led to stability. This analytical approach became central to his mindset. Spiritually, his adolescence was marked by a growing rejection of religious confusion. He was deeply disturbed by the presence of foreign idols and mixed worship practices, because they represented inconsistency and weakness. However, rather than reacting emotionally, he internalized a long-term vision of reform, believing that timing mattered as much as truth. This showed his emerging patience and strategic restraint. Hezekiah's good habits solidified during this phase: discipline, reflection, restraint, planning, and moral consistency. He avoided excess pleasure, palace indulgence, and reckless behavior common among young princes. He was not drawn to celebration or status displays. Instead, he valued preparation, knowledge, and quiet competence. Mentors recognized this and entrusted him with more serious responsibilities, exposing him to administration, resource management, and legal matters. This further strengthened his sense of accountability. Yet adolescence also amplified his inner conflicts. Witnessing constant compromise created anger that he rarely expressed outwardly. This suppressed frustration became both fuel and burden. Fuel because it drove his later courage, burden because it made him emotionally reserved and sometimes distant. Hezekiah struggled to trust authority figures fully because he had seen how easily leaders bent. Under pressure, this made him self-reliant but also isolated. He learned to carry weight alone, which later allowed him to stand firm during siege, but also prevented him from sharing vulnerability easily. Psychologically, this period cemented his internal moral compass but also introduced rigidity. He began viewing leadership decisions through a lens of right and wrong rather than flexibility and negotiation. This clarity gave him strength but limited adaptability. He believes small compromises led to large disasters, and this belief hardened with time. Intellectually, Hezekiah became fascinated with systems that supported survival walls, water supply, food distribution, and civic order. This interest was unusual for a prince, but logical for someone raised in insecurity. He understood that faith without preparation was naive, and preparation without conviction was hollow. This balanced mindset set him apart from idealists and opportunists alike. His adolescence was also shaped by silence around open resistance. Because defiance of Assyria was unthinkable during his father's reign, this forced Hezekiah to learn the value of timing understanding. That premature action could destroy, not save. Patience became not passivity, but strategy. Emotionally, Hezekiah matured faster than his peers, carrying an internal seriousness that sometimes made him appear distant or cold. Yet those close to him noticed deep empathy beneath this restraint, especially toward common people, refugees, and those affected by Assyrian campaigns. He internalized the suffering he witnessed, and this deepened his resolve to protect rather than dominate. One of his emerging weaknesses during this phase was excessive self-monitoring. He constantly evaluated his thoughts, intentions, and future decisions, fearing that any internal compromise could eventually lead to external collapse. This created anxiety, but also ethical consistency. By the end of his adolescence, Hezekiah was no longer simply reacting to fear. He was preparing to confront it intelligently. He did not yet have power, but he had clarity, and this clarity distinguished him from the generation before him. He had absorbed fear without becoming controlled by it, learned patience without becoming passive, and developed conviction without becoming reckless. Phase 3 is crucial because it marks the moment when Hezekiah stops being a product of his environment and begins becoming a corrective force against it. His identity as a leader formed not through conquest or ambition, but through quiet resistance, deep thinking, and disciplined self-control. This was the stage where the king who would one day survive Assyria was forged internally long before he faced it publicly. As Hezekiah moved fully into youth, the quiet, disciplined observer of adolescence began transforming into a deliberate future leader. This phase of his life was defined by preparation rather than authority, because although he did not yet wear the crown, the weight of the kingdom already rested on his shoulders internally. Youth for Hezekiah was not about ambition or public recognition. It was about readiness. He understood that Judah's survival would depend on competence, not charisma, and foresight, not force. During these years, he immersed himself in learning how a kingdom actually functioned beyond ceremony and titles. He studied administration closely, observing how resources were collected, stored, and distributed. He paid attention to how officials responded to pressure and how corruption quietly weakened institutions. This sharpened his intolerance for inefficiency and dishonesty. One of his strongest good habits during this phase was structured thinking. He broke complex problems into parts and sought long-term solutions rather than temporary fixes. Unlike many young princes who relied on inherited advisors, Hezekiah questioned systems and tested assumptions. Militarily, he did not dream of conquest, because he knew Judah could not compete with empires in open battle. Instead, he focused on defense, understanding terrain, walls, supply lines, and population morale. He observed Assyrian siege tactics carefully, learning how cities fell not through direct assault alone, but through starvation, water control, and psychological exhaustion. This knowledge later shaped his obsession with infrastructure, especially water security. During his youth, Hezekiah became deeply interested in Jerusalem's physical layout, studying how people moved, how water flowed, and how the city responded to pressure. This practical curiosity was not academic, it was survival-driven. He recognized that faith alone would not protect a city without preparation, and preparation alone would fail without unity. Spiritually, his convictions hardened during this phase, but matured as well. He moved beyond reactionary rejection of compromise toward a coherent vision of reform, believing that national identity required clarity, consistency, and leadership by example. He did not yet enforce these ideas publicly because he understood timing mattered, and premature reform could fracture an already fragile society. Patience continued to be one of his defining strengths. Yet this patience also masked growing internal pressure, because carrying a vision without authority created tension. Emotionally, Hezekiah learned to manage fear without denying it. He accepted danger as a constant rather than something to be eliminated. This realism allowed him to plan calmly under stress, but also increased his internal burden. He rarely shared doubts or fears openly, believing leaders must remain composed to inspire stability. This habit strengthened his public image later, but isolated him personally. During his youth, he also developed a deep sense of responsibility toward common people, rather than elite circles. Exposure to refugees, laborers, and city workers reinforced his belief that leadership existed to protect, not exploit. This empathy shaped his later decisions during siege, when civilian survival mattered more than symbolic resistance. One of his weaknesses during this phase was increasing rigidity of vision. Having witnessed compromise lead to humiliation, he began believing strongly that deviation from his moral framework invited disaster. This reduced his tolerance for dissent and nuance. Although it strengthened decisiveness, it limited adaptability. Intellectually, Hezekiah became selective, in whom he trusted, valuing competence, integrity, and consistency over loyalty or status. This habit later helped him build a reliable inner circle, but also narrowed his perspective at times. As youth progressed, the contrast between him and his father became stark. Ahaz ruled through appeasement and anxiety, while Hezekiah prepared through discipline and foresight. This silent divergence created internal tension, but also clarity, because Hezekiah resolved never to repeat what he viewed as leadership failure. He did not seek validation from his father or court approval. Instead, he focused on aligning his actions with long-term survival goals. This phase also marked the beginning of Hezekiah's reputation among priests, scholars, and administrators as someone serious, reliable, and morally grounded. Although he avoided public confrontation, his quiet consistency earned respect. However, carrying the future mentally without authority emotionally exhausted him at times. He experienced moments of doubt, questioning whether preparation would be enough against an empire like Assyria. Yet, rather than abandoning his vision, he refined it, adjusting expectations from victory to survival. This adjustment is crucial because it explains why his later resistance was defensive rather than aggressive. By the end of his youth, Hezekiah was fully formed internally, even if not yet crowned. His habits, discipline, foresight, patience, planning, moral clarity, and empathy were firmly established. His weaknesses, rigidity, emotional isolation, and internal pressure were also set. Phase 4 reveals that Hezekiah did not stumble into leadership. He prepared for it, deliberately shaped by fear, but not ruled by it. His youth was not loud, but it was powerful because it built the foundation for decisions that would later determine whether Jerusalem lived or died. The king who would survive. Assyria was already present long before he faced it openly. When Hezekiah finally ascended the throne of Judah, he did not inherit glory, strength, or stability. He inherited a kingdom already bent under fear, exhausted by tribute, and fractured in identity. The throne he sat on was not a seat of power, but a burden shaped by decades of submission and compromise. Judah at this moment was politically weakened, economically strained, and spiritually divided. Assyria still loomed in the background like an unavoidable shadow, and every decision Hezekiah made was measured against one question: would this provoke the empire? The transition from prince to king forced a psychological shift in Hezekiah because preparation now had to become action, and internal conviction had to become public leadership. Unlike kings who celebrated coronation, Hezekiah approached kingship with sobriety and urgency, aware that symbolic authority meant nothing without decisive reform. His first realization as king was that Judah's weakness was systemic, not accidental. It was the result of long normalized fear, ineffective leadership, and moral confusion. Internal opposition emerged immediately, not in open rebellion, but in resistance to change. Because many officials, priests, and elites had adapted comfortably to Assyrian dominance, submission had become routine, and reform felt dangerous. Hezekiah faced a silent but powerful challenge, convincing his own people that survival did not require surrender. Psychologically, this was more difficult than facing a foreign army, because fear had become internalized. Early in his reign, Hezekiah displayed one of his defining strengths: decisiveness. Grounded in preparation, he did not rush into confrontation. With Assyria, instead, he focused inward, recognizing that a fractured nation could not withstand external pressure. He began assessing institutions, leadership structures, and religious practices with a clear intent to restore coherence. This phase tested his patience because change invited backlash, and reform threatened those who benefited from compromise. Emotionally, Hezekiah felt the weight of inherited failure, knowing that his father's decisions had shaped present vulnerability. Yet he resisted the temptation to blame or publicly condemn the past. understanding that unity mattered more than judgment. This restraint showed growth because earlier rigidity softened into strategic discipline. However, the burden of kingship intensified his tendency toward isolation. Now responsible not only for vision, but for consequences Hezekiah internalized. Stress rather than sharing it widely. This increased his sense of loneliness, but also sharpened his focus. He became increasingly selective in counsel surrounding himself with individuals who demonstrated integrity, competence, and courage rather than status or tradition. This reorganization of influence quietly shifted Judah's internal power balance, setting the stage for later reforms. The broken throne also forced Hezekiah to confront the limits of idealism. He recognized that moral clarity alone could not rebuild a kingdom. Resources, logistics, and administration mattered equally. This realization reinforced his practical mindset, distinguishing him from purely spiritual reformers. At the same time, he remained deeply aware that any visible strengthening of Judah could attract Assyrian attention, making every internal improvement a calculated risk. Leadership for Hezekiah became an exercise in timing, choosing when to act and when to wait. His early reign was therefore marked by deliberate pacing rather than dramatic gestures. He rebuilt trust slowly among the population by demonstrating consistency, reliability, and personal discipline. People noticed that the new king did not indulge in luxury or public display. Instead, he worked quietly, reinforcing the perception of seriousness. This helped stabilize morale after years of fear-based leadership. Yet fear did not vanish overnight, and Hezekiah faced moments of doubt, questioning whether reform without confrontation was merely delayed submission. This internal conflict pushed him toward deeper commitment because half measures felt indistinguishable from surrender. Becoming king crystallized Hezekiah's identity not as a conqueror or diplomat, but as a guardian, tasked with preventing collapse. His goal was not expansion, but endurance, not domination, but protection. This mindset placed him at odds with imperial models of leadership, but aligned him with the needs of a small, threatened kingdom. Phase 5 is critical because it marks the moment Hezekiah's internal preparation meets external responsibility, and his leadership philosophy becomes visible. The broken throne did not weaken him, it clarified his purpose, forcing him to lead not from inherited power, but from earned resolve. This was the stage where survival ceased to be theoretical and became an immediate responsibility, shaping every choice he would make as king. Once Hezekiah secured his position on the broken throne, he moved into the most dangerous phase of his reign, not war, but reform. This stage required confronting fear that had settled inside Judah for generations, and challenging systems that had normalized compromise. Hezekiah understood that Assyria's greatest victory over Judah was not military, but psychological. Because fear had reshaped identity, weakened values, and taught people to survive by bending. Radical reform, therefore, became an act of resistance before any battle was fought. Hezekiah began by targeting the source of confusion: religious fragmentation. Foreign idols, altars, and practices introduced during his father's reign had blurred Judah's sense of purpose and loyalty. He ordered the removal and destruction of these idols, knowing that this decision would anger powerful groups and provoke internal unrest. This was not symbolic cleansing, it was ideological warfare aimed at restoring clarity. Hezekiah believed that a people unsure of what they stood for could not withstand external pressure. One of his strongest habits emerged fully during this phase: moral courage combined with consistency. He did not partially reform or negotiate with compromise, he acted decisively and uniformly. Temples were purified, sacred practices restored, and worship centralized, not to control faith, but to unify identity. This move challenged regional traditions and local authorities who had benefited from decentralized power. Resistance arose quietly. Priests complained, elites feared retaliation, and some citizens worried that abandoning Assyrian-influenced practices would invite destruction. Hezekiah faced this backlash with calm resolve rather than force understanding. That fear could not be cured through coercion. His leadership during this period was instructional rather than authoritarian. He framed reform as restoration rather than revolution. Psychologically, this phase revealed both his strength and his flaw. His clarity inspired confidence, but his intolerance for ambiguity limited dialogue. He saw compromise as a slippery slope, and this rigidity, while effective, reduced flexibility. Socially, the reforms slowly rebuilt national cohesion, shared rituals created shared identity, and fear began to lose its grip. People started seeing themselves as a community again rather than isolated survivors. Hezekiah also focused on moral discipline, reinforcing justice, accountability, and responsibility within leadership ranks. Corruption that had flourished under submission was confronted, and this further strengthened institutional integrity. However, these actions increased tension with Assyria because visible strengthening of identity often preceded rebellion. Hezekiah was aware of this risk, but believed that internal weakness was more dangerous than external threat. His faith during this phase was not blind optimism, but disciplined conviction rooted in preparation and awareness of consequences. One of his lesser-known good habits surfaced here: restraint. He resisted public provocation, avoiding loud declarations or symbolic defiance. Reform was conducted quietly, steadily, and methodically, minimizing immediate imperial attention. Yet internally, Hezekiah carried increasing pressure because reform without confrontation delayed, but did not remove the Assyrian threat. Emotionally, he bore criticism from both sides: those who feared Assyria and those who demanded immediate resistance. This isolation tested his resolve, but also clarified his leadership. Because he learned to operate without validation, one of his bad habits also became more visible during this phase: emotional suppression. He rarely acknowledged exhaustion, doubt, or fear publicly, which preserved stability, but increased personal burden. As reforms took hold, Judah slowly transformed from a fearful client state into a disciplined, unified society. This did not make it powerful, but it made it resilient. Hezekiah's reforms did something crucial: they shifted Judah's mindset from survival through submission to survival through preparation and identity. Phase 6 is the moral turning point of Hezekiah's life because it redefined what survival meant. No longer was survival about avoiding conflict at all costs. It became about preserving who they were even if conflict came. This stage set the foundation for every decision that followed, including defiance, siege, endurance, and eventual survival. Without these reforms, Jerusalem would have fallen before Assyria even arrived. Identity reclaimed became the first true victory in a story not defined by conquest, but by endurance. After reclaiming Judah's identity, Hezekiah turned his full attention toward a reality he knew could not be avoided. Assyria would return, and when it did, faith alone would not stop siege engines, starvation, or psychological collapse. This phase of his life reveals Hezekiah at his most practical and intelligent, because preparation became his form of resistance. Unlike kings who waited for invasion and reacted in panic, Hezekiah planned years in advance, studying how cities actually fell. Assyria rarely lost battles because it mastered siege warfare, cutting water supplies, isolating populations, spreading fear, and waiting for hunger to do the work. Hezekiah understood that Jerusalem's greatest vulnerability was not its walls, but its water. Without water, no city could survive, no matter how strong its faith or morale. This realization led to one of the most remarkable engineering achievements of the ancient world: the underground tunnel that would later bear his name. Hezekiah ordered the redirection of Jerusalem's main water source, the Gihon spring, away from exposed channels into the city itself through solid rock. This was not a symbolic project, it was a life-preserving strategy designed to deny Assyria its most effective weapon. Workers labored underground in darkness, carving through stone, guided only by sound and instinct, meeting from opposite ends in a narrow passage. This tunnel ensured that even if Jerusalem was surrounded, cut off, and isolated, it would not die of thirst. The project required secrecy, coordination, and trust, because discovery by Assyrian agents could have triggered immediate attack. This phase shows Hezekiah's ability to combine patience with urgency, because while he did not provoke Assyria openly, he prepared for its worst response quietly. Alongside water security, he reinforced Jerusalem's walls, repaired weak points, and strengthened gates. He stockpiled food, organized civilian labor, and ensured that resources could be distributed. During prolonged crisis, unlike conqueror kings, Hezekiah planned not for expansion, but endurance. Psychologically, this phase marked a shift from moral reformer to survival strategist. Fear was no longer an emotion to suppress, but a variable to manage. Hezekiah taught his officials and people that fear could be neutralized through preparation and clarity. This mindset slowly replaced helplessness with discipline. One of his strongest habits, foresight, reached its peak here because he thought not in days or months, but in siege timelines, calculating how long the city could hold under pressure. This required emotional strength because preparing for siege meant accepting the possibility of invasion without denial. Hezekiah did not promise safety, he promised readiness. This honesty built trust even as tension increased. However, this phase also intensified his internal pressure, because preparation without confrontation meant living in constant anticipation. Emotionally, Hezekiah carried the weight of knowing that every wall, every tunnel, every storehouse represented an unspoken admission that war was coming. His tendency toward emotional isolation deepened as he focused on logistics rather than expression. Yet his empathy remained evident in how preparation prioritized civilians rather than elites. Water access, food security, and shelter planning centered on keeping the population alive, not merely protecting leadership. This distinguished him from imperial rulers who treated populations as expendable. Assyria ruled through terror, Hezekiah ruled through protection. The engineering focus of this phase also reveals his intellectual humility. Because he trusted skilled workers, planners, and craftsmen rather than relying solely on advisors or priests, he understood survival was interdisciplinary, requiring faith, engineering, administration, and psychology working together. As these preparations advanced, Judah's transformation became visible not in banners or armies, but in readiness and morale. People began believing survival was possible not because Assyria was weak, but because they were prepared. This shift in belief was critical because siege warfare often ended through psychological collapse. Long before walls were breached, by preparing materially, Hezekiah strengthened morale indirectly. Phase 7 demonstrates that Hezekiah's greatness did not lie in dramatic speeches or battlefield victories, but in quiet, unseen work done before crisis arrived. The tunnel beneath Jerusalem symbolized his entire leadership philosophy, unseen. Patience cutting through resistance, one careful strike at a time. When Assyria finally came, Jerusalem would stand not because of luck, but because preparation had already rewritten the odds. This phase proves that survival is rarely accidental. It is engineered long before history records it. After years of preparation, reform, and silent endurance, Hezekiah reached the moment. Every cautious leader both anticipates and fears the point where preparation must turn into decision. Defying Assyria was not a single announcement or dramatic gesture. It was a calculated withdrawal from submission that unfolded through action. Rather than words, Hezekiah stopped paying tribute, not loudly, not proudly, but deliberately, knowing that Assyria would interpret silence as rebellion. This choice marked the irreversible shift from survival through obedience to survival through resistance. Psychologically, this was the heaviest burden of his life because he understood the cost better than anyone. He had studied Assyria's methods, its punishments, its patience, and its cruelty. He knew that once defiance was detected, there would be no negotiation, only response. This knowledge did not paralyze him, it clarified his resolve. Hezekiah accepted that submission no longer guaranteed safety, it only delayed destruction. Defiance at least preserved dignity and possibility. This decision revealed the full maturity of his leaders. Hit because it was not driven by pride, ambition, or confidence, but by sober calculation. Judah could no longer afford fear-based survival because fear had already hollowed it out. Defiance became not an act of aggression, but an act of honesty. Politically, Hezekiah understood Judah stood alone. Neighboring kingdoms had fallen, alliances had failed, and Assyria tolerated no equal partners. This isolation intensified the risk, because there would be no rescue, no reinforcements, and no external pressure to stop Assyria's advance. Hezekiah's strength during this phase lay in his acceptance of isolation rather than denial of it. He did not pretend help would come, he prepared his people to stand alone. Internally, this moment tested every habit formed since childhood: discipline, patience, foresight, and restraint. He resisted the urge to announce rebellion publicly because Assyria thrived on spectacle and provocation. Instead, he allowed defiance to speak quietly through non-compliance. This silence forced Assyria to respond on its own terms rather than reacting to insult. Emotionally, Hezekiah carried intense internal conflict. Because defiance meant exposing civilians to unimaginable danger, yet he believed that continued submission would eventually lead to the same outcome without resistance. This moral calculus haunted him because leadership now involved choosing between two forms of suffering. He chose the path that allowed agency and preparation rather than helplessness. One of his flaws surfaced sharply here: rigidity of conviction. Once the decision was made, he did not entertain alternatives or retreat. This decisiveness prevented panic, but also eliminated flexibility. However, in the context of Assyrian politics, hesitation would have been interpreted as weakness. Hezekiah's refusal to waver sent a subtle message to his own people that fear would no longer dictate policy. Morale during this period was fragile yet focused. Citizens sensed the approaching storm, but also felt grounded by preparation and leadership consistency. Hezekiah addressed his officials and military leaders, privately emphasizing readiness rather than rhetoric. This avoided unnecessary panic while reinforcing discipline. Spiritually, this phase deepened his reliance on faith, not as escape, but as anchor. He understood that logic and preparation could only take them so far, and that endurance would require psychological resilience beyond calculation. Yet his faith remained grounded. He did not promise divine intervention, he promised steadfastness. This honesty distinguished him from leaders who manipulate belief to mask risk. Assyria's intelligence network soon detected Judah's non-compliance, and the empire's response began forming slowly, methodically, and inevitably. Hezekiah knew the clock had started, and that time now belonged to Assyria's schedule, not his own. Waiting became an act of courage because anticipation often breaks leaders before invasion arrives. His ability to maintain calm discipline during this waiting period demonstrated emotional mastery forged over decades. Phase 8 represents the moment when Hezekiah's life story shifts from internal struggle to external confrontation. Everything before this moment was preparation, everything after would be consequence. The king who had learned to live with fear since birth now chose to face it directly without illusion. Defiance was not hope, it was responsibility accepted fully and without retreat. This was the moment Judah stepped out of Assyria's shadow, not knowing if light or destruction awaited, but knowing that survival without choice was no longer survival at all. When Assyria finally moved, it did not rush or hesitate, it advanced with the slow certainty of an empire that had never been denied. Sennacherib, king of Assyria, launched his campaign like a tightening fist, beginning not with Jerusalem, but with the surrounding cities of Judah. This was deliberate because Assyria understood that fear spreads faster than armies. One by one, fortified towns fell, walls were breached, populations slaughtered or deported, and survivors were left to carry stories of terror to the capital. The countryside burned and fields were destroyed, ensuring that even survival carried hunger and loss. Refugees flooded toward Jerusalem, carrying not only fear, but proof that resistance had consequences. Hezekiah watched as his kingdom was reduced piece by piece, exactly as he had predicted in his studies. Assyria did not seek immediate confrontation with Jerusalem because it wanted isolation, exhaustion, and despair to do the work first. Sennacherib sent envoys and messages designed to break morale. Rather than walls mocking Hezekiah, questioning his faith, and reminding the people of every city that had already fallen. This psychological warfare was precise and calculated because Assyria understood that if Jerusalem surrendered without a fight, it would preserve Assyrian resources and reinforce its legend. The Assyrian field commander stood outside the city, speaking loudly in the language of the people, ensuring that fear was shared publicly, not hidden. He listed defeated nations, mocked their gods, and promised that Jerusalem would be no different. This was not empty threat, it was supported by visible evidence of destruction surrounding the city. Inside Jerusalem, panic spread quickly because fear that had been suppressed for years now surged to the surface. Parents worried about children, soldiers questioned endurance, and memories of Assyrian brutality resurfaced with terrifying clarity. This was the moment preparation was tested not by siege engines, but by psychology. Hezekiah's leadership during this phase was crucial because panic could collapse the city. Before a single stone was thrown, he ordered silence, refusing to engage publicly with Assyrian taunts, understanding that response would legitimize fear. This restraint required immense emotional control because remaining silent while one's people were insulted challenged every instinct of authority. Yet Hezekiah understood that Assyria thrived on reaction and that dignity lay in discipline. Internally, he faced the heaviest weight of his life because the suffering unfolding around Jerusalem was the direct consequence of his decision to defy the empire. Every fallen city, every crying refugee, was a reminder of the cost of resistance. Yet retreat was no longer possible because surrender now would render all preparation meaningless. Hezekiah chose to absorb this guilt privately rather than allowing it to fracture leadership. He met with advisors and priests not to seek escape, but to reinforce resolve, emphasizing that fear had been anticipated and that endurance was now the only strategy. The people of Jerusalem watched Assyrian forces move with confidence, setting up camps and demonstrating control without immediate attack. This waiting was itself a weapon, stretching nerves and magnifying uncertainty. Assyria wanted the city to imagine starvation, thirst, and collapse long before they arrived. But Jerusalem was not unprepared. Water flowed through hidden channels, food was rationed, and defenses held. This material readiness slowly countered psychological assault as days passed without immediate disaster. Yet fear did not disappear, it transformed into tension and exhausting constant pressure. Hezekiah addressed his people carefully, avoiding promises of victory and focusing instead on endurance, reminding them that Assyria was flesh and blood, not destiny. This framing mattered because it shifted focus from inevitability to agency spiritually. This phase intensified Hezekiah's internal dialogue because logic and preparation had reached their limit and outcomes were now beyond calculation. He sought counsel from Isaiah not as a replacement for action, but as reinforcement of purpose. Their exchanges framed the conflict as more than political survival. It became a test of whether fear would define reality Assyria's invasion reached its psychological peak when letters were delivered directly to Hezekiah mocking his trust and predicting inevitable collapse. These messages were designed to isolate him personally, separating leader from people by suggesting he was misleading them. Hezekiah's response revealed his deepest habit: emotional containment. He did not answer with rage or denial, but with reflection, choosing not to internalize Assyrian narratives. This refusal to accept the enemy's framing was a form of resistance, as important as any war. Phase 9 captures the moment when preparation meets pressure and leadership is measured not by action but by restraint. Jerusalem stood surrounded, not yet attacked, but already tested more severely than many cities that fell quickly. This phase shows that survival against empire is not decided only by battles, but by the ability to endure fear without surrendering. Identity. Hezekiah's earlier life now converged into a single sustained act of resolve, holding together a city under the gaze of the most feared empire on earth. The storm had arrived, and the outcome was no longer theoretical, it was imminent, written in the tension between waiting armies and a city refusing to collapse from fear alone. As the Assyrian armies settled around Jerusalem, the reality of isolation became unavoidable. No allies approached, no messengers arrived with hope, and no external force stood between the city and the most powerful empire of the age. Jerusalem was alone, encircled by disciplined soldiers who had destroyed countless cities before it. The siege did not begin with immediate assault because Assyria preferred to let time, hunger, and fear weaken resistance. Days passed slowly, marked by watchful silence from the enemy camps and strained vigilance from the city walls. Inside Jerusalem, life contracted inward. People rationed food, limited movement, and measured each day by survival rather than progress. The air was heavy with uncertainty because siege warfare attacked the mind before the body. Hezekiah understood that his greatest enemy during this phase was not Assyrian weapons, but internal collapse. Panic, despair, and loss of morale could undo years of preparation faster than any battering ram. His leadership therefore shifted from planning to psychological containment. He enforced discipline without cruelty, silence without suppression, and order without illusion. Soldiers were instructed to hold positions, civilians were guided calmly, and information was controlled to prevent rumors from spreading unchecked. This balance required immense emotional strength because transparency risked panic, while secrecy risked mistrust. Hezekiah chose measured communication, reinforcing readiness rather than outcome. Water flowed through the hidden tunnel, confirming the wisdom of earlier preparation. And each day without thirst strengthened morale quietly. Food stores were carefully managed, reminding the population that endurance was possible. Yet fear persisted, because Assyria remained visible, reminding everyone of what awaited if walls fell. Assyrian commanders continued psychological warfare, shouting insults, questioning faith, and listing past victories, hoping repetition would erode resolve. Hezekiah ordered that these taunts be met with silence, not because he lacked response, but because engagement granted power to the enemy narrative. This silence became a collective discipline, teaching the city that reaction fed fear. Internally, Hezekiah carried immense pressure, because every choice now affected thousands of lives trapped within stone walls. Sleep was scarce, his thoughts constant, and his responsibility absolute. Yet his earlier habit of emotional containment allowed him to function without breakdown. Spiritually, the siege intensified his reliance on faith not as denial, but as grounding. He sought counsel from Isaiah, framing the waiting not as abandonment, but as a test of endurance and identity. These interactions reinforced meaning during stagnation because siege time stretches perception, making ours feel heavier than battles. One of Hezekiah's strengths emerged clearly here: composure under prolonged stress. Many leaders perform in moments of action, but falter during waiting. Hezekiah held steady during uncertainty. However, his weakness also deepened isolation. Because he bore fear privately, rarely sharing doubt to preserve stability, the people sensed this seriousness, interpreting it as resolve, which helped maintain cohesion. As days turned into weeks, the city learned to live under siege, adapting routines and finding small reassurances in structure, discipline, and shared purpose. Assyria waited confidently, believing time was on its side, but Jerusalem did not collapse as expected. Preparation began to counter reputation, and the absence of immediate disaster weakened Assyria's archaeological advantage. Phase 10 captures the essence of survival not through dramatic confrontation, but through sustained restraint, endurance, and leadership that refused to let fear define reality. Jerusalem stood not because it was strong enough to defeat Assyria, but because it was prepared enough to endure it. And in that endurance, the balance of expectations slowly began to shift, setting the stage for an outcome no empire had planned for, and no small kingdom had dared to imagine. As Jerusalem endured the siege with discipline and restraint, a moment arrived that no strategist could predict and no empire could control. The Assyrian camp that had surrounded the city with absolute confidence entered a night of stillness that felt unnatural even to seasoned soldiers. There were no attacks, no warnings, and no negotiations, only silence stretching across the hills. Outside Jerusalem, inside the city, tension remained high because silence from an enemy as powerful as Assyria often meant something worse was coming. Hezekiah spent this time in deep internal struggle, aware that preparation, faith, and leadership had carried them to the edge, but could not dictate what came next. This was the limit of human control, where outcomes moved beyond planning. According to ancient accounts, disaster struck the Assyrian camp suddenly and without warning. Disease, panic, or mass death swept through the army, leaving thousands unable to rise by morning. The same soldiers who had terrified nations were struck down without battle, without walls breached, and without a single Assyrian victory song. When dawn approached and watchmen looked out from Jerusalem's walls, they did not see advancing armies or siege engines moving closer. Instead, they saw stillness, bodies, and abandonment. Confusion spread quickly because such an outcome was beyond expectation. Assyria had never retreated from a siege like this, and certainly not from a city. It had not yet attacked. Reports confirmed that Sennacherib's forces were withdrawing, broken and stunned, retreating without explanation. The empire that defined inevitability had encountered something it could not command. Inside Jerusalem, disbelief replaced fear as reality settled in slowly, cautiously. Hezekiah did not rush to celebrate because he understood the danger of misinterpretation and premature confidence. Instead, he waited, confirming reports and ensuring discipline remained intact. His response during this moment revealed maturity rather than triumphalism, because survival did not require spectacle, it required stability. Emotionally, this was the release of decades of accumulated tension. But Hezekiah contained it, directing gratitude inward rather than outward display. The city emerged from siege not through battle, but through endurance, validating the philosophy that preparation and resolve could change outcomes even against overwhelming force. Historically, this moment shattered Assyria's image of total inevitability, because for the first time a small kingdom had faced the empire directly and survived intact. News of the withdrawal spread quickly across the region, altering perceptions of Assyrian power. Yet Hezekiah did not interpret survival as victory over Assyria. He understood it as preservation granted through endurance rather than domination. Spiritually, this phase confirmed his belief that faith was not passive hope, but active trust sustained through preparation and restraint. The impossible night marked the convergence of everything that shaped Hezekiah, from childhood fear, youth, discipline, reform, strategy, and isolation, into a single outcome that defied expectation. Phase 11 stands as the silent climax of the story, where the most powerful empire in the world stepped back without explanation, and a small city remained standing, not because it conquered, but because it endured. This moment did not end danger forever, but it permanently altered history, proving that even the most terrifying systems can fail when confronted by patience, preparation, and unbroken resolve. When the Assyrian armies withdrew and the hills around Jerusalem fell silent, the city did not step into celebration, but into exhaustion. Survival had spared Jerusalem from destruction, but it had not spared Judah from loss. The countryside lay. Devastated cities were burned, fields ruined, families shattered, and the psychological scars of terror lingered in every household. Hezekiah understood immediately that survival was not an ending but a responsibility, because a city that lives after near annihilation carries invisible wounds. Refugees poured back through the gates, carrying grief, hunger, and stories that could not be erased by victory. Leadership in this phase required tenderness rather than defiance, and patience rather than courage. Hezekiah shifted his focus from endurance to restoration, organizing food distribution, shelter, and labor not as grand projects, but as acts of healing. He resisted the temptation to frame survival as triumph, because triumph could breed arrogance, and arrogance invited future disaster. Instead, he framed the moment as mercy and warning, reminding his people that survival came at a cost that must be honored through humility. Emotionally, this period was heavy for Hezekiah, because the silence after crisis often reveals pain that fear suppresses. Now that the threat was gone, grief surfaced openly. He carried responsibility not only for those who lived, but for those who did not, and this moral weight deepened his seriousness. Politically, Judah's position remained fragile because Assyria was wounded but not destroyed, and other powers watched closely, interpreting survival as opportunity or threat. Hezekiah avoided provocation, choosing restraint over expansion, understanding that survival depended on stability, not ambition. One of his strengths, empathy, became visible as he listened to the suffering of common people, allowing their pain to inform policy rather than ignoring it for political convenience. Yet this phase also exposed one of his weaknesses, internalizing guilt. He questioned whether any alternative path could have reduced suffering, despite knowing intellectually that submission would not have spared Judah either. This self-examination did not paralyze him, but it added emotional depth to his leadership. Socially, the people of Judah began rebuilding identity not through pride, but through shared memory of endurance, which created cohesion stronger than fear. Rituals were observed not as victory celebrations, but as acknowledgments of survival, reinforcing humility rather than dominance. Hezekiah's governance during recovery emphasized order, fairness, and accountability, ensuring that chaos did not replace crisis. This careful leadership prevented fragmentation at a moment when weakened societies often collapse. Internally, Phase 12 shows that surviving an empire is not only about outlasting invasion, but about managing what comes after without losing moral direction. Hezekiah proved that endurance must be followed by wisdom, because a nation that survives violence but forgets humility often invites greater destruction later. This phase transforms survival into legacy by teaching Judah how to live after fear, without becoming consumed by it. The king who had prepared for siege now prepared his people for peace equally carefully, knowing that survival without reflection could be as dangerous as defeat. After the external storm passed and Judah began to breathe again, Hezekiah faced a battle far more personal and unavoidable than any empire. His own body began to fail, and illness struck him with a severity that made survival uncertain. This moment was deeply unsettling because it came not during crisis, but after endurance, when the weight of responsibility finally slowed his pace. For a king who had spent his life preparing for external threats, confronting mortality without an enemy felt disorienting. Hezekiah had faced Assyria with clarity and discipline, but illness stripped away control, forcing him into stillness and reflection. Psychologically, this phase exposed the limits of preparation because no tunnel wall or strategy could protect him from physical decline. Facing death after survival created a painful contrast because he had preserved his kingdom, but might not live to guide it. This realization stirred fear not of dying itself, but of unfinished responsibility. He questioned whether his life's purpose ended with survival or extended into long-term guidance and stability. Emotionally, Hezekiah allowed vulnerability in this phase more than ever before, because the certainty of death removes the need for composure. He turned inward, confronting regret, doubt, and the weight of decisions that had shaped countless lives. Spiritually, this illness intensified his reliance on faith not as public leadership tool, but as personal grounding. He prayed not for victory or longevity as entitlement, but for meaning and clarity. According to tradition, his life was extended, granting him time he had not expected to receive. This extension did not produce celebration, but sobriety, because being given more time also meant being given more responsibility. One of Hezekiah's strongest habits, reflection, deepened here, because he now understood survival as temporary stewardship rather than achievement. However, this phase also planted the seed of a later weakness. Because surviving illness after surviving Assyria subtly reinforced a sense of exceptionality. He had lived through two events that should have ended him, and this created tension between humility and subconscious pride. Emotionally, Hezekiah emerged quieter, more inward, and more aware of time's limits. He became more deliberate, less tolerant of waste, and more focused on legacy. This phase reshaped his leadership philosophy because mortality reframed power as fleeting and influence as fragile. Phase 13 is essential because it humanizes Hezekiah, stripping away the image of the unshaken survivor and revealing a man confronted by his own limits. The king who had mastered fear now faced the certainty that no amount of courage could defeat time itself. And in accepting this truth, he gained wisdom, but also stepped closer to the subtle dangers of pride that often follow extraordinary survival. After surviving both empire and illness, Hezekiah entered a phase where danger no longer arrived through armies or disease, but through subtle shifts in perception. News of Jerusalem's survival spread far beyond Judah and reached rising powers, who studied Assyria closely, searching for cracks in its dominance. Among them, Babylon sent envoys not with weapons, but with curiosity, admiration, and strategic interest. For the first time in his life, Hezekiah was not approached as a threatened ruler, but as a survivor, whose endurance carried symbolic weight. This change in how others saw him quietly altered how he saw himself. When the Babylonian messengers arrived, Hezekiah welcomed them openly and showed them the wealth, armories, treasuries, and resources of his kingdom. This act was not driven by arrogance alone, but by a human desire to be understood, recognized, and respected after decades of fear-based obscurity. Psychologically, this moment revealed a blind spot, because extraordinary survival can create the illusion of invulnerability. Hezekiah, who had spent his life guarding information, now revealed it willingly, believing that survival itself signaled strength. This decision exposed one of his core weaknesses, pride, emerging not as dominance, but as relief, seeking validation. The same discipline that kept him restrained under threat softened when danger seemed distant. The prophet Isaiah warned him that revealing Judah's strength invited future consequences. Because empires fall, but ambition travels patiently. This warning reframed the moment not as diplomatic success, but as strategic error. Hezekiah accepted the warning but could not undo the exposure, because knowledge once revealed cannot be reclaimed. Emotionally, this phase introduced regret, not for defiance or preparation, but for a lapse in restraint. It showed that wisdom forged under pressure must be maintained even when pressure lifts. The contrast between his earlier caution and this openness highlighted how survival can weaken vigilance. Phase 14 does not erase Hezekiah's greatness, but deepens it by revealing his humanity. Because even the most disciplined leaders remain vulnerable to pride once fear recedes. This phase serves as a warning that surviving catastrophe does not eliminate risk, it transforms it. The king who had mastered visible threats now faced invisible ones, proving that leadership requires constant self-examination not only during crisis but especially after it ends. As Hezekiah moved into the later years of his life, the noise of crisis slowly faded, and was replaced by silence, reflection, and responsibility. The king who had lived under constant threat now ruled in a period of relative calm, yet this calm carried its own weight. Because maintaining peace often requires as much discipline as surviving war, Hezekiah governed quietly, avoiding unnecessary conflict, resisting ambition, and focusing on stability rather than expansion. Unlike many rulers who chase glory in old age, he understood that Judah's survival depended on restraint, not conquest. His leadership during this phase was marked by consolidation, strengthening institutions, maintaining order, and preparing the next generation, rather than rewriting history through force. Emotionally, Hezekiah became more inward, less reactive, and deeply aware of time's limits. Survival had taught him that endurance mattered more than recognition, and this understanding softened his earlier rigidity into wisdom. He accepted that number leader controls outcomes beyond their lifetime, and that stewardship rather than permanence defines true leadership. One of his strongest habits, reflection, matured fully here as he revisited decisions, not to glorify them, but to learn from them. He acknowledged both courage and error, understanding that legacy is shaped as much by humility as by success. His earlier weakness, emotional isolation, remained, but evolved into contemplative distance. Rather than guarded silence, he engaged less in public persuasion and more in quiet counsel, guiding rather than commanding. The people of Judah viewed him not as a conqueror, but as a protector whose greatest achievement was that they still existed. This perception mattered because it redefined what success looked like. For a small kingdom living among empires, Hezekiah's final years were not marked by dramatic events, but by continuity, which in itself was rare in an age of constant upheaval. Politically, he avoided provoking Assyria or aligning aggressively with emerging powers, remembering the warning he had received. This restraint showed growth because he learned from pride rather than being consumed by it. Spiritually, his faith matured into acceptance, trusting that outcomes beyond his life were not his to control. This phase solidified his legacy as a king who valued survival, identity, and responsibility over domination and spectacle. When Hezekiah eventually died, he left behind not an empire, but a living nation still rooted in its land with memory intact. Phase 15 completes the arc of his life, showing that greatness does not always end in conquest or collapse, but sometimes in quiet continuity. The king who survived Assyria did not seek to outlive history through monuments, he lived on through the people and the city that remained standing long after the most terrifying empire of the age had withdrawn. His life closes not with noise, but with endurance fulfilled and responsibility passed forward. When Hezekiah's life finally came to an end, it did not arrive with violence, betrayal, or collapse, but with quiet completion. The king who had spent his entire existence under the shadow of fear, illness, and empire died not as a conqueror, but as a guardian who had finished his watch. His death marked the closing of a chapter defined not by how much land was gained, but by how much destruction was avoided. Judah did not crumble at his passing, nor did chaos immediately follow, because Hezekiah had built systems, identity, and discipline strong enough to outlast his presence. This alone distinguished him from many rulers whose deaths triggered collapse. Historically, his life left a rare imprint because he proved that survival itself could be an achievement worthy of memory. Assyria, the empire that erased nations, could not erase his city during his lifetime. And that fact reshaped how power was understood in the ancient world. Hezekiah's habits, discipline, foresight, restraint, patience, and moral clarity shaped every major outcome of his reign. His flaws, rigidity, emotional isolation, and moments of pride did not undo his legacy, but humanized it, reminding history that endurance is carried by imperfect people. Unlike rulers remembered for monuments or conquest, Hezekiah was remembered for preservation, for choosing responsibility over glory and preparation over impulse. His story became a reference point for later generations, not as a promise of invincibility, but as proof that courage combined with wisdom can change outcomes. Even when victory seems impossible, the city he protected continued to stand, his people continued to exist, and memory outlived terror. Assyria eventually fell, its palaces turned to ruins, and its kings became names carved in stone. While Jerusalem remained alive, carrying the story of a king who refused to let fear define destiny, Hezekiah's death closed a life shaped by pressure from birth but guided by conscious choice. History does not remember him because he defeated Assyria, but because he survived it. Without surrendering identity, his legacy teaches that true leadership is not measured by dominance, but by what is preserved. When power passes, the king who survived Assyria left behind no empire, but something rarer: continuity, dignity, and the proof that endurance can outlast even the greatest machines of destruction. And in that endurance, his name continues to live, not as legend inflated by victory, but as truth carved into the memory of history itself. Hezekiah matters not because he changed the ancient world by force, but because he revealed a different model of power that history often overlooks. In an age dominated by empires, conquest, and spectacle, he demonstrated that endurance, discipline, and preparation could alter outcomes without rewriting maps. His life shows that leadership is not always about expansion, but about preservation, not about defeating enemies, but about refusing to be defined by fear. Hezekiah was born into weakness, raised under humiliation, and surrounded by inevitability. Yet he did not internalize surrender as destiny. Instead, he transformed fear into foresight, faith into discipline, and preparation into survival. His story challenges the idea that small nations must disappear under great powers, and that resistance only has meaning when it ends in victory. Jerusalem survived because Hezekiah understood limits, respected reality, and still chose responsibility over submission. This lesson extends beyond ancient history into every era where individuals, communities, or nations face overwhelming systems. Hezekiah teaches that clarity of identity matters more than size, that preparation outlasts panic, and that restraint can be stronger than aggression. He also reminds us that even the strongest leaders are human, vulnerable to pride, fatigue, and error, yet capable of learning and correction. His legacy is not perfection, but balanced courage without recklessness, faith without denial, and authority without domination. Assyria represented the machinery of inevitability. Hezekiah represented the quiet refusal to collapse beneath it. History remembers conquerors loudly, but it remembers survivors deeply. Because survival preserves memory, identity, and possibility. In the end, Hezekiah's greatest achievement was not that Jerusalem stood, but that it stood without becoming what it feared. His life closes the story with a truth that echoes across centuries, that endurance guided by wisdom can outlive terror, and that sometimes the most powerful act in history is simply to remain standing when everything says you should fall.